Welcome everyone. You are at Turning to Tchinas, Voices in the Vernacular, and tonight we're going to learn a bit about what are Tchinas, what can they tell us about the daily rhythms, religious aspirations, and private hopes of those who recalled them. And in tonight's shir, we'll explore the role that these parallel liturgical Yiddish prayers played in Jewish women's lives in early modern Ashkenaz. Moving across time and into the modern age, we'll consider how Tchinas, written at times by men and at times by women, shaped new possibilities for popular piety and self-expression. And to kind of show us through that, we have Ms. Dahlia Wolfson. She is a doctoral candidate in the Comparative Literature Department at Harvard. She is the Text and Translations Editor at Ingeveb, a Journal of Yiddish Studies, and is a 2021 Translation Fellow at the Yiddish Book Center. Say hi to Western Massachusetts for me. And it's a pleasure to have her teach tonight. Source sheets will be shared in the chat. I have one request is please do not share these outside of the class. I understand that that's a bit questionable when we're also sharing this on Facebook Live, but some of these translations are still a bit rough, and there will be a more finalized, polished one to share. So if you like what you hear and you want to share a class recording with someone else, don't worry, they will not be left unsourced.
Great. First of all, I'm sorry, this is going to take 1 second. The exact dual monitor situation that I feared has just occurred. So just need 1 second to pull up the sources. In the meantime, I wanted to dawdle here and say, first of all, that it's really a pleasure and a privilege, such a privilege to be here in the Zoom room of the virtual Beit Midrash, the virtual Bais Medrash of Drisha. It was one of my first experiences being in a supportive and warm, challenging and rewarding Beit Midrash through the winter high school program, which if you have daughters, send them there. And I also wanted to say that being able to delve into Tchinas has been for the purpose of this this presentation, this class, as well as something that is not my main area of research, but it's certainly something I'm passionate about, has been a real delight, especially because just last night I was able to pull up my great grandmother's siddur right here, which made it both through Imperial and Soviet Russia, made it through New York, has Tchinas. I will show you in a second what that looks like. Here we go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, great. It's showing up? Okay, yeah. So the sort of screenshots over there on the top and on the bottom are from the siddur that we assume was printed sometime after 1900. And there's a Tchina von Erev Yom Kippur by die Lichtmachen, which is a ritual that we'll talk about later, about a folk ritual of candle making. As well as a Tchina, and this one's kind of nice because it says Tchina, wenn ein Mensch ein Tanis hat, soll das sagen, es mag sein ein Mann oder ein Frau. So when someone is about to when they're fasting, they can say this when they're about to break their fast, and it can be a man or a woman. They're about to break their fast after mincha. So these are just two examples of Tchinas that I found in my great grandmother. That's her over there. This is Fega Isirivna Dardik Gershonovich. And she had this Tchina in her siddur. So that's just a small personal connection that I wanted to share as I was opening up this subject. Great. So before we go anywhere, I wanted to ask, and let me see if I can find the chat here. I wanted to ask if you have any associations with Tchinas. I just wanted to see in the chat if you could throw throw anything in there, or something that you might speculate has any relation to tchinas, or maybe you just don't know what they are and that's why you're here, and that's fine as well. But just if you could type something into the chat, I'll give it a minute. Vernaculars, yes, great. Candle lighting, that's something that we'll be talking about. Women, yes, in fact, women and men, we're about to find that out as well. Women folk prayer, Yiddish lit, studying Yiddish. Being illiterate, innovative prayer, fantastic, yes. Differences between tchinas, something I'm not sure we'll get to fully today, but I do have a bibliography for you, don't you worry. Great. Okay, and I don't know if I'll be able to see everyone. Paraliturgical, yes. Thank you, Eve. Oh, that's not something I wanted to do. There we go. Now, just to get a sense of my readers here, my learners, can I have a raise of hands for those of you who can read Yiddish? Excellent, excellent. I'll be counting on you. And how about those of you who have read Old Yiddish or have some skill in that? Yes, fantastic. Okay. I will need your help. Wonderful. Okay. So with that, let us, oh, and yes, we have davening in the Mamalesh and his mamas. Yiddish was forbidden in my mother's home. I know nothing. There are places to get Yiddish classes. In fact, there are some teachers in here that are fantastic. Okay, wonderful. And with that, I will stop dawdling because we have our presentation and we have some work to do. Okay, turning to tchinas, voices in the vernacular. Okay. So before I say anything, I wanted to say that this presentation would not be possible without this book. This is by Chava Weissler, Voices of the Matriarchs, Listening to the Prayers of Early Modern Jewish Women. And she is really the scholar who did this pioneering work that was published in the 90s about tchinas. Many of the things that I'll be talking about today that we know are these things I'll be discussing. The merits of this talk are in her name, and any lacunas or lacunae or any sort of things that I may not know are due to a lack of scholarship or my own sort of oversights. But if you'd like to read further into this, I urge you to look into Voices of the Matriarchs. It's really a fantastic piece of scholarship. And the source of many of the things that we'll be looking at today. Okay. So what is a tchina? So a tchina, tchinas are basically Yiddish prayers for private devotion. They are like other genres of popular, yes, okay. Like other genres of popular religious literature in that time period, such as paraphrases of the Bible, ethics, sort of ethical books, as well as rabbinic tales. They were published began to appear in sort of the 16th century and flourished and grew up through the 18th, 17th, and 18th century. So that's sort of the time period that we're working with. They were private petitions in Yiddish. And some of the features of these tchinas are that they were, first of all, phrased in a type of personal address. So one of the interesting things about tchinas is that they use the du form, which is the Yiddish informal du, rather than the ir form, which is a formal u in Yiddish. So something that we have here, this is just a random tchina that I picked out. I'm reading starting from the S, which might look like an esh to the Hebrew readers. That S there, es soll sein bewilligt zu dir Gott unser Eltern. So here, the address is du or dir, using this informal address towards God, and they're really sort of personal, private, intimate prayers to God. Another feature of these tchinas is that generally they exhibit a flexibility in time and place. So they're not part of the standard liturgy as we know it. They're sort of, I think we saw the word paraliturgy in the chat. So they are not considered tefillah proper, but they are recited at different ritual occasions. So, and in terms of time and place, it really varies quite a bit. So they might be recited in synagogue, they might be recited in the cemetery, they might be recited at home, they might be recited before the birth of a child, they might be recited when you're sending your child off to cheder, they might be recited during Rosh Chodesh. They're really a very, very wide range of events and times and places in which tchinas are recited. Here in this sample tchina that you see on the top, there's a superscript, which is something you'll find often with tchinas, that there's a superscript indicating when this tchina should be recited. So here we see on the top the superscript, it says, Die tchina sagt man am Montag mit größer Kavana. So this tchina is said on Monday with a lot of kavana. And this is just one example of, and there are tchinas for every day that you could recite, and this is just one example of how there are occasions for the recital of tchinas. And lastly, as you can see, as we saw in the chat, they're written in Yiddish, which was the vernacular of the Jews of Europe. The language of the street and the language of the home and the language of the popular folk religious literature would have been Yiddish, and they are generally written in something called Tchina Lashon, which is a Western Yiddish, but that's perhaps a little bit too detailed for right now. Great, so that's sort of a overview of what a tchina is. Language of tchinas. Okay, so the next thing that I just want to touch on, I mentioned that they're written in the vernacular, and that's Yiddish as opposed to what would be called Lashon Kodesh. So Lashon Kodesh is the general catch-all term for Hebrew and Aramaic. It literally means language of holiness. The relationship between Hebrew and Yiddish is something that we'll come to see is, I mean, it marks the accessibility of Hebrew and the accessibility of Yiddish is something that can be seen along, it sort of is marked along an axis of learning and access to Hebrew texts, and that becomes something also quite gendered. I think I'll clarify this in a moment, but what I wanted to do first is have us read an explanation from Musar book, from a book of ethics that was published in 1596. And in the third chapter of this book, the author clarifies why he wrote the book in Yiddish. So I was wondering if I could get a volunteer to read this source. Either if you'd like, you could try your hand at what's on the screen, but I've also offered it in the source sheet for with either the actual letters in the Old Yiddish, or you could try it in what I sort of mocked up as a closer to standard Yiddish. Yes, Eve, please. And I believe it's, let's see.
One away?
Yeah, number one.
Oh, I was, wait, that's, this is something different.
Number one in the source sheet.
Okay. Der Perech steht, warum ich es teitschmech. Das Buch wird gemacht, teitsch, denn Weiber und Mannen, die da sein als Weiber und können nicht viel lernen, und es kommt im Schabbos und Jontef und lehen darinnen, da können sie oder sie, da können sie es verstehen, was sie lernen, denn unser Sforim sein in Lashon Kodesh und schreiben zuweilen Pilpul euch der Gemorre machten sie mit verstehen. Sorry, I didn't get all of that very well.
No, that was fantastic. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Great. And could someone read the English translation?
Oh, I see. Right. There was a translation right under it. Whoops.
No, that was great. Thank you. Ellen, were you raising your hand? Yeah, please.
Chapter describes why I made a translation. This book is written in translation, which doesn't really mean translation because he's not translating some other text, I think. Because women and men who are like women who cannot study much, and on Shabbos and Yom Tov, they can read here and understand that which they read, because our books are in Lashon Kodesh, and from time to time write pilpul from the Gemara so they can understand.
Yeah, great. And so to Taich generally mean in sort of its earliest definitions are as German or Germanic language.
Right.
And here it's being talked, meaning here he's referring to why is it written in Yiddish. Great, yeah. So what might be making these, what is sort of this category of women and men who are like women? Why is it being addressed to them in Yiddish? Yeah, Sylvia. Sorry, Sylvia, did you?
Okay. Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Yes.
Yeah.
Because I guess they may not have known Hebrew. They may not have been very educated in Hebrew or Aramaic, but they did know Yiddish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Yes, so in society of that day, it would have been very uncommon for women to be able to read Hebrew and Aramaic, and they might have received some level. So unless you were from a rabbinic family where you would have possibly been exposed to this, to Hebrew and Aramaic or some sort of Torah learning in those languages, you would be definitely speaking Yiddish, but you may or may not have received even some schooling in Yiddish letters. But certainly the most accessible language to you on a literary level would be Yiddish. So it's addressed to women who can read in Yiddish, and it's also addressed to men who are like women. And in this case, what's being interpreted as womanly here, right, is not having access to Hebrew, because you are traditionally not obligated in Torah learning at that level in Hebrew and Aramaic, and you also you're neither obligated nor do you necessarily have that level, nor do you usually have that level of education. So Yiddish is also sort of feminized in that way, whereas Hebrew and Aramaic belong in a more male sphere. So I just wanted to bring that in as a way of alerting you to the sort of gendered aspect that we're dealing with here. And so tchinas are oftentimes addressed to women. So they're addressed to women, and in introductions that you see to tchinas, they will be usually addressed, as we just saw. They will be addressed. They'll assume a female reader. That doesn't mean that men weren't reading them, although a lot of them are specific to women's rituals. And another term that I just wanted to introduce was Weiberteich, which is just the semi-cursive Ashkenazi script that we'll be seeing throughout this class. So it's this chart on the right, is courtesy of one of my professors. And if you're familiar with Rashi script is just a semi-cursive Sephardi script. So Weiberteich is a semi-cursive Ashkenazi script, and in part it comes to be associated. Why is it called Weiberteich? Because it's associated with popular religious literature that's aimed at women, and tchinas will be usually printed in this script. Alrighty. Okay, so writ large, this is something that Chava Weissler discusses in her book, and I saw mentioned in the chat about the difference in trines. Chava Weissler separates out these trines, which, like I said, you start seeing them around the 16th century. They start being printed, and they're printed well into the 18th, 19th century. But writ large, she distinguishes between two types of trines that are printed in Western Europe and trines that are printed in Eastern Europe. The trines that are printed in Western Europe tend to be printed in appendices or in sort of larger collections, whereas trines that are printed in Eastern Europe tend to be sort of smaller, cheaper booklets that are focused on one topic or two topics, but they're generally shorter. Those are some very kind of broad differences. What we'll be looking at here are a couple of examples of these trines, just to orient you around some important works, some classic hits. So what we have here first is a Seder Trines Ubakashas. And the first edition of it was printed in 1718. It was compiled by a man named Mattatya Subotky, and it includes 35 trines, which is quite a lot compared to something Eastern European in its day. And there are trines for things like the penitential season, so Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Elul, reproductive life, personal prayers upon misfortune. I think we could quickly read also this introduction because it's a fun one. Could I get a volunteer for that? And you can choose which one you'd like to read if you'd like to read it. Yes, Sylvia.
Unmuted. Okay, starting with ihr.
Yeah.
Ihr liebe Weiber und Maiden, tut laufen zu die liebe neue Trine und tut sie kaufen und lasst euch nicht sein zu teuer in Geld. Ich hab Tag und Nacht über der Trine getracht und hab sie nicht wegen meiner gemacht, nur le Covid, Hashem Yitbarach, drum kauft behend die Trine hat ein End.
Excellent. And could someone read us the translation in the English? Yeah, I can't see who's raising their, oh, Sharon?
Okay. You, dear women and girls, run to the dear new Trine and buy it. And don't think it is too expensive, as I have considered this Trine day and night, and I did not do it for my own honor, but for the honor of Hashem, blessed be he. So buy it quickly before the Trine has an end, is sold out.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. So here we see, this is just one introduction of many like this, which are fairly typical for enthusiastic publishers who want their Trine to be competitive, and they want to sell the newest, best, greatest Trine. So you get this sort of pompous introduction. We also see here the address to women and girls. So this is just one example of what that might sound like. Here I also brought in another example of Seder Trines Ubakashas. If that one had 35 trines, this one has, I believe, over 100. So these collections can grow quite large. So on the left we have what is sometimes referred to as a register, right? Like a table of contents or a register. In the middle we have the introduction page, and on the right you'll see that there's actually something really, I think, moving, which is these material traces of the people who would have used it. So would someone like to try reading that inscription there? And sorry if I can't see if you're raising your hand. Yes, Leah.
Big print?
Hmm?
Like Haisha, Miriam, that one?
Yeah,
Right, okay, so Isha Miriam Ishet Rav Yassel.
yeah, great. And who knows? But but this is you know, a trace of maybe she wrote it herself. Maybe her man who also wasn't, her husband who also wasn't particularly literate, or at least not, you know, perfectly literate in this way that we're discussing, wrote it, you know, didn't quite know how to write it, how to spell it correctly, but inscribed it in this way. So Trenes also, you know, they're both the texts that we can use to understand either or try to understand the people who write and the people who read Trenes. And they're also, as physical objects, which is hard to see over Zoom, but as physical objects, they bear the traces of actual lived practice. So this is just one sweet example. So these two were Western European examples. And then we have one of the earliest printed Trenes. This is printed in Eastern Europe. Approximately in 1600. It's called Ein Gor Schöne Trine, a very beautiful Trine. And can I get a reader for, let's find out who wrote it. Yes, Sandra, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Ist viel Zeit lang ein Sod gewesen. Bei ein Teil fromme Weiber haben sie bei sich losen bleiben und niemand lassen ausschreiben. Nun haben sie sich bedacht und haben sie in Druck gebracht.
Sehr schön. Dank. Would someone like to read us the translation that I believe is here? Anyone? Oh, Dvir.
This Trina was for a long time kept secret among a group of pious women. They let it remain among themselves and let no one copy it. Now they have rethought the matter and have brought it for publication.
Great, thank you. So this is again, attribution is sort of a tricky territory with early modern printing, but Chava Weissler brings it in as an example of early female authorship, and we would like to, and it probably is that way. Again, can't stand behind it 100%, but I'm going to give it 90%. So this is an example of women writing, Trenes for women. Before that, we were looking at men as compilers, men as editors, men as writers, which was very, very common, but you also have examples of women writing for women. Ein Gor Schöne Trine, another example from Eastern Europe. So I think I said this a little bit already, but again, it's a sort of, it is a complicated thing to be turning to texts and thinking about whether, you know, especially when some of these texts are written by men. So in a sense, they might be prescribing religious life, and how do we reconstruct what that spirituality and piety would have looked like? At the same time, the Trenes are among the few sources that we have of this kind of, these sort of women's voices speaking to us in the vernacular across history. There are others, but this is one of the sources, and so it is an entry point, and there are complications to it, but it is an entry point to thinking about how Jewish women in early modern Europe would have prayed and experienced a relationship with God. And this is another material example that I brought in because I think it's also very nice. This is a microfilm, which is why it's in black and white. I want you to hold out your thumbs in front of you, like we're seeing on the right. Just hold out your thumbs for a second. Okay, now look between your thumbs. That's how small this Trina is. That's how small this collection is, right? It's tiny, right? He's holding it. Whoever's holding down this Trina is holding it like this. It's a tiny little collection of Trinas. And yet it holds so much. So it has a Birchas Hamazon, right? It's got the blessing after food, Birchas Hanehenin. It's got Chal Nida and Hadlakas Haner, acronym Chana, which were the three major mitzvahs for women. It's got Kriyat Shema and Tehillim, and it even has these little pictures, which are so nice. So what do we have here on the left? We've got a husband and his wife. They're eating, or they're drinking grape juice possibly, and there's a little desert scene. Quite unlikely that would be their outside, but nice little illustration there. And then here on the top right, let me see if I can open see what folks write in the chat. Can anyone identify what they might be doing on the top right? Yeah, she's taking a bath, most likely before she, yeah, exactly, before she goes to the mikveh. And then on the bottom, in the center, lighting for Shabbos. Beautiful. Yeah, and it says Shabbos there, Shel Yom Tov. Also, Zoe, I'm sorry, it's the microphone is hard to see and I haven't studied it in depth, but presumably it's a Shabbos ritual that they're engaged in. Great. And on the left top, yeah, challah. Yeah. Great. So Tchinas can be a very rich source of, I think, connecting, first of all, through, in this experiential way, thinking of what things might have been like for them. And these illustrations are kind of a nice way to enter that mindset. Great. Okay, so what I'd like to do with you now is to look at 3 Tchinas that were written by women. And what we'll do is, I think, just half an hour, it's just not enough time, but we'll touch upon some of the themes that are evoked and think about how women in that time made meaning out of the spiritual possibilities and rituals available to them. So let's, and this is a Tchina Shoferblosen, so it would have been read before, and there are also parts that are read just as the shofar is being blown. And it was written by Sarah, who was the daughter of the Maggid of Dubno in the 18th century. So can I get a reader? And I only brought the English here, but there are places to find the Yiddish as well. Can I get a reader for the English source number 5? Yes, Renana. Thank you.
Turn on the video for a moment. First, we beseech our mother, Sarah, that she pray for us at this hour of judgment, so that we may be judged innocent. Since Hashem, blessed be they, added the letter He from their name to hers, so must she also have the attribute of mercy. Have mercy, our mother, on your children. Make a special plea that our children not be separated from us. You know well how bitter it is when a child is taken away from its mother, as happened to you when your son Yitzchak was taken away from you and you yearned for him. I also beseech our mother, Rivka, to pray for her children and for our father and mother, that they should not, chas v'shalom, be separated from us. You know very well what it is like to yearn for one's father and mother, for when Eliezer, the servant, took you away from your father and mother and brought you to your husband Yitzchak, you too wept very much. Thus you know how painful it is to be without a father and a mother. We also beseech our mother Rachel to pray for us that we may be inscribed and sealed for a good year and that we may never know any sorrow. We know full well that you cannot bear to hear of any sorrow, for when your beloved son Yosef was taken away to Egypt, the Yishmaelim caused him great anguish. He fell upon your grave and began to cry, Mama, have pity upon your child. How can you bear me to see me in anguish? You love me so much, and now I am so unhappy, and no one has mercy upon me. You could not bear to hear the language of your child, and so you answered him, My dear child, I hear your weeping and your bitter cry. I will always have mercy upon you, and will pray for you, and you will hear your anguish. Therefore have mercy on our sorrow and anguish and trembling before the judgment, and pray that a good year may be inscribed for us, so that we may never know sorrow. Amen.
Great. Thank you. Does anyone have any other things that surprised you, or things that you were noticing that seem like they're meaningful in terms of an expression of what prayer is about, or how women's sort of the metaphors or the figures that are being brought in to pray for to pray on this occasion? Yeah, Sharon.
Well, it seems to me like these are women creating women's midrash. And that's quite beautiful. It's the same style in a way of as other standard midrashim we've seen, but focused on women's particular interests. And it's very beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, and she integrates this is something that you can really, like the Chava Weissler's book does really well. She points out the different midrashim and rabbinic sources that are being drawn on that Sarah is using to compose this prayer. Yes, Elizabeth.
Hi, I was just wondering if that our children not be separated from us, if that was like appealing to a real historical circumstance of children being taken, to serve in the army of whatever leader is oppressing the Jews at that particular moment in Russia or Eastern Europe or something like that. So I was just wondering if that's more than like metaphorical, but like possibly like really considering the historical reality.
That's a good question. I can't answer it for Cyril's lifetime specifically. It would certainly, I mean, Jews were at times taken hostage. There were certainly conditions that would make them vulnerable and make their children vulnerable. So I think it sort of it's a prayer for like the general contingencies of living in Europe as a Jew. I can't answer with a specific historical event. Yes, Nissan.
I'm just thinking how her father must have learned so much from his daughter, the world famous Dubna Magid. And his daughter is actually Sarah. I mean, Sarah, I believe, is a diminutive form of Sarah. So that lead-in paragraph really, really resonates.
Mm-hmm. And he probably taught her. I mean, I'm sure because she was from a rabbinic family, it's probably one of the reasons that she has access to this sort of library. So I think it would have been a very fruitful parent-child relationship, one of sort of teaching and learning from one another in that sense. Yes. Are there hands that I'm not seeing? Deborah?
I was really struck by how overwhelmingly human the Imahot and Yosef are here, in a way that you almost never hear them sounding quite that much like real people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This sort of personal side to the matriarchs. And I think here, like the drama of the child-mother relationship is really, really played up in this very human way. Absolutely. Dvir?
Also, I was just struck kind of like comparing to regular prayer. We use like God and the relationship with God as the metaphor, like that we access to the emotional side of things. And here, using the individuals themselves, we don't see the forefathers portrayed in that way either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to address the in terms of the translation. I took it from the Open Siddur project, so there may be translation decisions that are made there that would be interesting to interrogate further. But I'm not entirely sure about the decision around the day, and it would require going back to the source. But thank you for the question. Were there other hands? Okay. Sharon, do you have your hand up?
Sorry.
Okay, great.
Sylvia, I did.
Yes, Sylvia.
I was just wondering about the Tsena Orena, which is also kind of very personal, and this. And, I never really gave thought to who wrote the Tsena Orena, but was it also women?
The Tsena Orena, I believe, was authored by a man. I don't want to be, but I will not say things I'm not sure about. But I can clarify that for you when I edit the source sheet. And the Tsena Orena is could certainly be serving as a source of inspiration, or a source that Sarah might have read, because it integrated different sorts of interpretations. Yeah, thank you, Pammy. Great, thank you, Marcia. The Ten Arena written by Yankov Ben Yitzchak, yeah. But yeah, thanks, Esty. But the Ten Arena was something that was widely read by women who were able to read in Yiddish. Yes, Rebecca.
Okay, so I was really impressed by the sort of intergenerationality of this Tefillah, that on the one hand it's a prayer for the children, but also for one's parents, and the unifying factor was like hoping for sort of a lack of separation, this idea of keeping everybody close. And so I thought it was really beautiful. That's all.
Yeah,
it was like reaching in both directions.
Yeah, yeah, definitely a sort of multi-generational conversation. Yes, Evelyn.
It seems to me that I've never heard that Rivka cried. You know, this is the first time I'm hearing that Rivka cried so hard, or that whole interaction with Yosef, that he was crying. It's like they've reinterpreted, they've created a scene to make their prayer meaningful. Whereas, because I've never heard this type of a situation that interprets Rivka as crying when she was separated from her parents, or Rachel even is crying when she was separated. They seem to have gone along very happily to be married.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, that's the power of Midrash, and also here of I think that Sarah is making, as she's centering this particular matriarch's experience and drawing out these themes between mothers and children. And if you would like to delve further into this prayer and see where these sort of intertextual links are coming from, I encourage you to look at the book. But yes, it is a rich interpretation. She's not coming up with this herself. She is drawing upon midrashim. But I think in terms of the composition and the choosing to focus on bringing out these themes, it really is a unique decision. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to the next one. Okay, great. So this next trina is a trina that was written by Leah Horowitz, who, in fact, her full name, let me just make sure I get this right. Her full name, as you can see on that far, the scan on the far right, her full name was Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah. Good, nice name. She was the daughter of a Yaakov Yaakov, who lived from 1680 to 1755. And she was one of 7 children. There are even memoirs that speak of her, that recall her as a child, I think at the age of 12, where she's helping a guest, a male guest, I think, who's come to study with her brother. And he's sort of struggling with something in the Talmud and with reading the Rashi, and she comes up to him and she explains it to him. So she was a very learned woman, and she lived no later than 1800. I don't think we have exact dates for her birth and demise. But if we look at this trina, we can see that actually it has 3 parts. So what I've put in here are the 3 sort of transition points. So I wonder, I'll just read the first I think the first bits. So we have Zeh Ashar Hashem Tzadikim Yavo Bo, which is what would that be there? That would be Hebrew, right? Then we have the second part, which is, it says Karibon Alam Val Maya, and so Aramaic. And then here you'll see our Viberteich again. Yeah, I think, yeah, Ribbon Olamim Duher von der Welt. So we have Yiddish. So it's actually a 3-part trina. She writes a Hebrew introduction. There is an Aramaic piyut, and then followed by a Yiddish trina. So it's really a fantastic and unexpected piece of paraliturgy. Let's just have a look at very briefly at the Hebrew parts and the Yiddish parts. So can I get a reader for the Hebrew section? Yeah, Esti.
Given the need for a different kind of tchina, even though it is not often that a woman engages in Torah discourse, the crown of Torah is set out for all the inhabitants of the world, and that includes women. Moreover, by composing this tchina, I believe I am benefiting the public, since in any event, women are talkative, gossiping in the synagogue on the Shabbat. Note the verse that states, when God gathers Israel from the ends of the earth, they shall come with weeping. Women cry. That is their contribution to bringing about the redemption. However, a person's prayer is only heard in the synagogue. Therefore, since the day of the Lord is near, it is proper that our women come to the synagogue morning and evening to pray with copious tears, not in order to receive a reward.
Great, thank you. Any initial reactions to this? Okay, so because we're also coming up on time, I'll just say that this is sort of an very interesting introduction, because even as she's positioning herself as someone who can take on the crown of Torah, right? And she's a very learned woman, and she's insisting on a role as someone who can compose the trina, he would be engaging in Torah discourse. At the same time, she puts women, she sort of relies on this stereotype of women gossiping, but she's relying on the stereotype in order to establish women as those who can actually go to the synagogue and end up praying there. So it's this sort of, relying on something that isn't such a great generalization about women, but in order to then say, oh, well, but women can have efficacious prayer, and part of that is crying. It is proper that our women come to the synagogue in the morning and evening to pray with copious tears. So it's kind of, it's this dance of someone who is actually in a very, very unusual, exceptional place in her traditional Jewish society, where she's very learned, but doesn't quite fit, and is authoring a trina. And then we have, can I get someone to read these portions of the Yiddish section? Yes, Ellen. Thank you.
Am I still? Yeah. Rachel, you promised that by her merit, I'm not sure why it's her, we merit that we, the children of Israel, would come out of exile. Then when Israel was sent into exile, they were led not far from the grave where our mother Rachel lies. Israel begged the enemy to allow them to go to Rachel's grave. Israel came to our mother Rachel and began to cry and scream, "Mother, mother, how can you watch as we are being led away from you into exile?" Rachel went up to God with a bitter cry and declared, "Master of the universe, your mercy is much greater than the mercy of humans." I should have made an emphasis on the "your" there. "In that respect, I had mercy on my sister Leah when my father made the switch and gave her to my husband. He instructed her so that my husband would think that she was I. Although this caused me great sorrow, I told my sister the signals. How much the more so you, God, are merciful and compassionate. You should simply have mercy and take us out of the exile now. It should come to pass by her merit and the merit of our mother, Leah, who cried," all right, I'm blocked there, I can't see it. Who cried day and night, because she was worried about being married to Esau, so much that her eyes went dark, but her merit should you enlighten our eyes, by her merit, should you enlighten our eyes out of the dark exile. I think this is like, let's find, every possible simile we can get to.
Okay, I think we can pause there. Yes, thank you, Sally. Right. So there's an integration of different midrashim here. And any other thoughts on this formulation? Okay, so I'll just highlight in the meantime because there's not a lot of time left. So we do have here, the Aramaic version, and I encourage you to check this out in the book, has a far more sort of erudite intertextual quality to it. And in the Yiddish, the Tchina, the changes that are made in order to focus even more on the tiers. Yeah, exactly. Tiers have been thematic. So these tiers become a way for women to have something that they're able to perform and something that they're able to express their relationship through. And it's something that their foremothers do. And is something that even this, the simplest or most illiterate woman can express her relationship to God through, as well as being in relationship with these matriarchs. Yes, Anna.
Oh, yes. Well, you actually just said what I was going to say, but in terms of, if we're talking about literacy and lack of literacy, it really reminded me of that famous, I'm sure someone here knows the attribution, but that famous Hasidic story about the little boy who just knows how to whistle rather than to actually daven and know the words. So here we have crying, which of course, it's interesting. It comes from the heart. Of course, as an aside, though, just historically, and I think continued through the women in Edot HaMizrach, that there are professional criers, all the way back to the time of the Talmud, female criers at funerals. Of course, we'd have to look at the language and the words that we're using here. I'm sure the word for crying might have different versions, and we'd have to look at that also. But this kind of pre-verbal, pre-literate, from the heart coming out, when there's a long tradition of it.
I can't comment on Sephardi traditions around it because I'm just not familiar with.
Leave it.
This is not something I'm personally familiar with or can speak from knowledge. But there's also a profession of with plugmutters. So there are sort of professional criers in Yiddish culture, and yes, and Leora mentioned the Zogerke, who would have been someone who could lead these both translate from Hebrew into Yiddish and lead or read Tchinas on behalf of other women and for them to repeat after her. Great. Okay. Are there any other hands? Okay. I don't think we have quite enough time for. I will just quickly preview this, which is another prominent female author of Tchinas is Sarah Bas Tuvim, who lived around the mid-18th century, wrote a highly popular Tchinas collection called Shloisha Sharim, the Three Gates. So here she talks, he says, Ich Sarah Bas Tuvim, ich tue das von dem lieben Gott Baruch Hu, Shmo, wegen bin ich mesadir, Pam Sheni is noch ein Shene Naya Tchina, al Shloisha Sharim. So the first shar is about of the drei mitzvahs that we spoke about, the Chana, the three important mitzvahs. Then there's the second shar, which is for Azma ben Rosh Chodesh, for the new month, and the shar shlishi is Funyam Noraim. And this shar shlishi includes what is a woman's folk ritual known as Feldmesten, measuring the field, measuring the cemetery, as well as Knetlachlegen, laying wicks. And here, there's an excellent research on this that was made by a graduate student named Annie Cohen. And I put this link, and I'll share it in the source sheet, where she both talks about this ritual, has a source sheet for it, and also provides photos from a field report that was done in 1906, I believe, for women enacting this folk ritual, which involves measuring during the Yomim Noraim, measuring the length of the cemetery, as well as sometimes individual graves with candle wick, and then in the processing tchinas, and then around Yom Kippur time, and I believe there are slightly different rituals about this, but making a candle for the living and candle for the dead, that then gets burned in the home or in the synagogue. But the point is that Sarah Bas Tuvim writes a tchina. It's not necessarily this tchina. Oral versions of this probably existed before it. Maybe she was even working off a written version. We just don't know. We don't have enough material. But she writes a tchina that sort of thematizes this relationship between the living and the dead, and makes this women's folk ritual into a holy act that also has the effect of bringing about a redemption. So that's just another example of where in tchinas we might find insight into women's religious lives. There are 4 minutes left. I have so many more slides. So I will skip through them all and instead come to, I think, what is a sort of general point, which is that tchinas, I think, both help us understand the sort of horizons and possibilities for women's religious lives in early modern times, but also I think raise up a register of personal address and of things that are moments when spirituality feels best expressed in a personal and intimate register. And one nice example of that happened at the very beginning of the pandemic was published through the Open Siddur website through the tchinas project, which is a great project that you can check out. And it was a translation. It was a tchina for when there's an outbreak of the plague. It's translated also into English. And I think that sort of movement into our own vernacular also shows us how these tchinas were valuable forms of expression in the past and can continue in terms of their potential for expressing personal hopes and dreams, and leaving that kind of channel open. They continue to resonate today. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
And if you're following along on Facebook Live, also you should also ask questions.
I'm sorry if I can't see hands.
Sharon?
Yes, I'm thinking that all of these tchinas have such urgency, if that they are not trivial concerns. They are very urgent, important, immediate concerns. And I think in a way that separates it from most of the things we see in a traditional prayer book, except when we get to the Yomim Noraim, that it does not feel formulaic, it does not feel routine. But at the same time, they don't sound like the kind of thing a woman would say regularly. It sounds like the kind of thing she'd only say when there was a terrible problem to be addressed. And perhaps that's a function of the examples that Dalia has shown us. I don't know.
Yeah. So what I would say, first of all, is if you've seen one tchina, you've seen one tchina. So it's hard to make. I can't really make generalizations about tchina use, or the message of one tchina might not be the message of a different tchina. So it's hard to say, every individual woman's experience would have been different, how often she would have been saying them. In these large collections that I spoke about earlier, you really do have, these bigger trinas, or what maybe, these trinas that are used in a liturgical setting almost, where you'd be saying them in synagogue at different points during the prayer service. And then that could be a weekly experience, that could be a once a year experience, who knows? And you do have these trinas which are deeply personal for very particular situations, like let's say a child is sick. Leah Horowitz begins her introduction by saying, what is this? Why are we asking for very personal needs on Rosh Chodesh when we should be asking for a great redemption from exile? We shouldn't be asking for these small needs. We should be asking for much greater things. So yes, at times some trinas seem to ask for very pointed needs. Some trinas ask for very big sort of Jewish communal goals. And you really have to kind of dip in to see what each one offers. But thank you for noting that. Yes, Nissan.
Thank you. I use a Yiddish machzor on Yom Noraim, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and it has it's a regular machzor, but it has Yiddish on the side. These tchinas for men, I guess. And one of the things that you made me notice tonight is that those Yiddish supplications are all mentioning male experiences. I'll pay attention to Shem next time I use it. If they, even try to channel all the stories, any of the stories that you taught us, that you shared with us tonight, about the imahos, and it just struck me. Have you come across this? My other question is, did we learn together with Judy Goshen summers ago at Drisha?
I don't know. That I can't answer. I don't think so. But in regards to your first,
they let in guys at night.
In terms of the first question, like I said, there are so trinas were not necessarily only read by women. There may also have been men reading them. In addition, the trinas printing and publishing an inclusion history into the Siddur is sort of it's a bit of a chaotic thing, and some trinas may have been just translated from Hebrew trinot. So they're not necessarily, they may be addressed to women in the collection, but that doesn't necessarily mean that only women were reading them. And then when it comes to being included in a Siddur, that was up to the editor of the Siddur, presumably, and they may have chosen trinas that worked for both men and women. So the ones that we were looking at are really the three that we were looking at were recited by women, and they're part of women's customs and are talking about rituals that women were doing. But there are also trinas that are more general, like we saw in the trina that I had at first, right? That was from a Siddur. It's printed after 1900, has a trina, both a trina for something that is a woman's ritual and has a trina for breaking the fast. So I think that would be sort of on a case-by-case basis what trinas maybe were still popular at the point of printing, felt like they would be read by the audience that was being targeted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tamara?
My question is by definition unanswerable, but I was wondering if there's any sense of the proportion of trinas that were written that were published, and therefore, like, how much else is out there that was probably lost. It's an impossible question, but was this, how easy was it to get published, or was this a really rare special thing, do they think, whoever they is?
Yeah. I don't have enough expertise with the archives to answer that question. They were generally fairly cheap and printed on cheap paper, especially these Eastern European ones. So I don't know where that fell in terms of an expense. But they weren't supposed to be like highly expensive. These were made for sort of everyday women. So I don't think that they were like a highly expensive product in the shtetl economy or whatever it might be. How many survive, like what the collections that we have versus everything that was available. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't answer that question, but JTS has a whole uncatalogued collection, and someone needs to do the research to think about, how common they were. And I was having a conversation with this professor whose Aleph Beis chart I shared, and she said, we have to look at these, you have to look at them one by one and see like, oh, it's printed, but was it ever used? Are there grease marks on this trina, or was it just sort of printed by this publisher and he thought it would, make a buck, and it didn't, it was never really used. So so that's sort of a larger cause for a study. Yeah, Dvir.
First of all, beautiful presentation. Thank you. I was curious about in the first one that we looked at, there was mention of men who weren't very well versed in verse or something of the matter. Was that a large portion of the population? Like Chassidut took off in a similar time because people were doing nigunim and like they were speaking to a large amount of people who weren't necessarily learned in Lashon Kodesh, and kind of thinking, were there, even though these are directed towards women, was there usage? Is there indication of usage of large portions of the population?
So again, I can't answer this question in like a demographic, any sort of quantitative way. What I can say is that for these trinas that aren't uniquely specific to women's ritual, there is a possibility that they were being read by men. But there's not. I can't answer that question with certainty in terms of numbers or how widespread this was. If there's anyone in the chat who has more experience or thinks they know, you're welcome to chime in. But female readers existed as a category for popular religious literature. It was assumed, they were addressed as like the dear female reader. That doesn't mean that there weren't men reading them. It just meant that this market and this language was associated with these female readers. But there were also men reading other popular religious literature that was in Yiddish, and there were translations of Kabbalistic works that were translated into Yiddish. So men would have been reading those. But for trinas, I suppose, particularly with the trinas that are aimed at women, they may not have been reading those ones specifically. So that's the most I'll say. Thank you, Alona. Yes, also another great bibliographic reference.
All right, I'm glad to hear that people have so many questions, and it's been a joy monitoring the chat. Dalia, if people have further questions, is there a way that they can get in touch with you about that?
Yes, you can email me at my first name dot my last name at Gmail, or happy to be in touch, and I will update the source sheet there so that you have more places to go to keep learning.
And thank you everyone for joining tonight as part of Night Seder, as part of Wintersman, as part of a whole new element on prayer. Classes will resume again in the end of January with the start of our Spring Fun 2020. So please keep an eye out on our website. Please keep an eye out on our emails. And it's always a pleasure to learn with everyone. Dalia, thank you for teaching tonight.
Thank you.